we have a pleasure to welcome here with us Keti Chukhrov, who is associate professor at the School of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. She has authored numerous texts on art theory and philosophy. Her latest book, Practicing the Good, Desire and Boredom in Soviet Socialism, deals with the impact of socialist political economy on the epistemes of historical socialism. Her full-length books include, for example, To Be, To Perform, Theater in Philosophic Critique of Art, and a volume of dramatic writing, Merely Humans. Thank you very much, Keti. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bernard, Sami, Khatib, and Albert. Actually, I have already been at the discussion in Pristina on the same topic, and it's a very spontaneous attempt on my part to join the discussion. I had chance to listen to papers yesterday, but missed today morning, and will speak generally, somehow reproduce the map of negativity which I prepared for the previous meeting, but then will speak on semantic manipulations which erase negativity from discourse and thus help the autocratic lexicon to be inscribed not only into consciousness but even the unconscious of social space and of collective consciousness. But at the same time, how to treat today the idea of public space, which was termed by Laclau and Mouffe as agon, and to what extent it could be important for cultural production, and to what extent the manipulations and the mutations that took place in cultural production and concretely in cultural production in post-socialist space could grow into even bigger political autocracy. So to start, I will first show my screen to go through this formula of negativity. It's a bit simple, but still quite helpful. I hope you see it. So I will go through 7 sections or 7 methods of producing negativity to inspect how it is distributed in critical theory in general. It's a little bit improvised and it's not very deep, but it maybe could help to navigate and then to make critical comments or dispute whatever I made. So in the first case, or in the first section, I would call radical modernist negativity with Adorno, Agamben, Derrida, Bataille, Rosalind Krauss, which somehow hinges on apophatic ineffability or Dadaist transgression, and it resides also in claiming the antisociality of art. It is unable to claim that sociality of art is producible because capitalist sociality is negative, and one has to enhance this negativity and alienation, analyzing and deploring this alienation by means of even bigger apophatic ineffability. And the remedy to surpass unjust capitalist sociality can only take place through absolutely alien, newly unified aesthetics. And in this case, one has to deal with the inevitable anti-humanness of art, but one has to be aware of its macabre fatality. So this awareness of fatality and of macabre form of cultural production is part and parcel of all those authors enumerated above. Then in the second section, we would have psychoanalysis, and Bataille can be mentioned also in this case too, but mainly Freud, Lacan, Zizek, and psychoanalytical treatment of negativity, which is the philosophy of crisis and of clinic. It generates the thinking of clinic as the critical moment and as the crisis and as the acceptance of this crisis. And yesterday Sami already mentioned the seminal text, Freud's Culture and Its Discontents, which is crucial, and which follows probably Adorno's rejection of cultural industry and culture as such for its popular and populist methods of false harmonization. And in this case, we also have this awareness of negativity and rejection of some sort of harmonized humanism. Then with the third section, we have the tradition starting with Althusser, which is also anti-humanist and which is negative by definition, and followed by his disciples, Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, Lyotard, and I call it Möbius logic because it's not negative in a clear-cut way, but in this strategy, alienation becomes an aberration which can be approached as affirmative. So sociality is negative, as for instance in Althusser's interpellation, but this is precisely what can affirmatively construct subject. Or Foucault shows negative genealogy of bourgeois sexuality, but at the same time shows that this negativity and these forms of control can subversively be transformed into enjoyment. Or Deleuze-Guattari shows schizophrenia as another name of capitalism, but they can as well show how it can endow the production with creativity. Or Lyotard, in his aesthetics, in his book L'Humaine, or in his text The Tooth, the Palm, he pursues the similar logic when he needs to rely on negative capitalist semiology to then use it as the tool of subversive exodus. This strategy increases monstrosity and negativity of alienation, but it approaches it as some sort of subversive affirmation. Hence, for example, the metaphors of Stoicism that accept and reenact life as nonsense, and nonsense is of course negative, but it is played as some sort of acceptable performance. Or for instance, Deleuze discards dialectics and the Hegelian contradiction and the contradiction between the negative or its sublation and negative and not negative. So he tries to evade deep contradiction, but he supersedes it with performative lexicon and performative difference, which can also be looked at as an anti-harmony, of course. Therefore, this approach is definitely a Möbius twist of the negative into some sort of performative realization. And the heirs, or the nihilist heirs, to this mode are also known, such as numerous accelerationists, or Ray Brassier with his Nihil Unbound. In the fourth group, we have Cornelius Castoriadis, Jürgen Habermas, and Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Laclau. These are thinkers of social democracy who reside on negativity, include negativity, but somehow appropriate it in favor of the democratic forms of social negotiation. And the strategy in this case is to oppose unjust negative capitalist society with the attempt to generate institutional means of its critique and the discursive means of its transformation. And the terms such as agon, which is produced and suggested by Laclau Mouffe, is crucial here. But important to note that for Castoriadis as well as Laclau Mouffe, economic issues were not principal, and probably at that time, for instance, this book on negotiation of socialism, hegemony and socialism, I forgot the exact term, the exact title, was written in 85, and Castoriadis even much earlier. So I would say that this is the politics of Second International, not Third International, but Second International, which somehow tries to a little bit distance from October Revolution or communism, unlike Althusser's focus on self-critique, or unlike Balibar's focus on dictatorship of proletariat. And in this case, social antagonism somehow is more important than class struggle or the issues of economic or politeconomic inequality. So as I said, in this case, antagonism is definitely the negative productive tool, but it deals with transformation of capitalist components without fundamental methods. And various forms of engaged art and socially engaged art, of course, are crucial in this frame as anti-capitalist rethinking of sociality. In the fifth section, and well, you have to keep in mind that this is very, very superficial, and I simply didn't have time in these conditions in which we are here to go deeper. So I just go on with this map. Negativity that turns into enjoyed positivity, and we have here some thread from Foucault, as well as a little bit the critique of psychoanalysis. And we have here Judith Butler, Rosie Braidotti, Donna Haraway, and Paul Preciado, and some cases of gender and queer identity essentialism. And to account for this strategy, I would remember Marx's critique of Bohemian Lumpen commons, if you remember it from 18th of Brumaire, the critique of Bohemia by Marx, who indulged in transgression, indulged in this some sort of libertinage, but then this right for transgressivity is mistaken or is identified with emancipation. And in this case, exposure of one's liberties or one's deviances stands for revolt and emancipation. And of course, libertinage can be an emancipation, but it is not confined to it. Emancipation is not confined to liberties. So epistemologically important in this strategy is this carnival of indulgence or liberties, and what in fact is negative has to be changed and acquire the markers of enjoyed identity, which is emancipatory simply by the token of being exposed or being circulated, which is also quite important for the liberation of the society. Thus, in this strategy, once one extrapolates negativity or even the forms of trauma and the forms of subjugation, but one also learns to enjoy what is maybe decadent and what is exposed as traumatic. And this section or this attitude or approach was definitely extremely important for body performance, generally for the history of performance, and was important for feminist art as well. But you cannot overlook to what extent it also contains the enjoyment of this narcissist body, and narcissist in Freudian terms, and narcissist as the confinement to its libidinal and clinical elements. The sixth part would be posthumanist or New Age technoscientific essentialism, which somehow, I would say, tries to neutralize negativism and neutralize negativity, or maybe even bid farewell to negative politics and culture. Why? Because here we have, well, in all these above mentioned forms of negativity, we have awareness of what should be, what is the struggle and what should be fought. Here we have the loss of the loss. So what has been lost, and what you feel, for instance, in Adorno's writing as the loss of culture is ignored, and we have to face the loss of the loss of the understanding of what was lost. And we come across this approach in works by Latour, where laboratory supersedes politics, in Karen Barad, where mere biophysical performance supersedes concrete antagonisms, even in Willem Flusser or in Luciana Parisi, and generally the post-Hitler media theory, Froese and Ernst, or in cognitive studies. This strategy extends the previous counter-negativist paths, or the path of negativity as enjoyed affirmativity. And it believes that culture, humanities, social contradictions, philosophy, and even dialectics are, of course, forms of metaphysics, and they can be superseded or transformed simply by more positive or positivist or elemental description and technical tools, which need not be politicized to that extent, and can be modified technically or even by means of elemental digital intervention. Precisely this tendency stands for somehow bidding farewell in art to conceptual, Dadaist, paradoxical, political, and even negativist moves in art. But I would say that to a certain extent, the social democratic complacency in the latest period in art institutions can also maybe be blamed in softening certain political issues. Returning back to this techno-scientific essentialism, it is interesting that autocratic societies, well, we discussed today in these awful conditions of the war, the difference between democracy and autocracy. And I heard from the American left, for instance, who want to criticize their democratic governments and to blame democratic governments, be it Biden or whoever, that it is in fact also a neoliberal autocracy. Well, I would dispute this because today we see that no, there is certain difference even between false hypocritical democracy and the hardcore autocracy to start with. But another thing is that if there is the Platzdarm which could unite, for instance, neoliberal democracy or liberal democracy or the Erdoganist, Putinist or other forms of autocracy, it is of course certain sort of post-politics, post-philosophies, which is happy to deal with rather biochemical elements than political aspirations. And we see this biologization or digital biology in this context in aesthetics as well as political production. And it is here where, for instance, Putinist art or Putinist culture could be could stand with the so-called liberal democratic shift from the political and conceptual issues where sociality emancipation is more important than certain manipulation with the algorithmic materiality or biochemical materiality. Finally, I would mention something that becomes even more problematic nowadays with the contemporary situation, how to deal the Marxist materialist dialectics and such names as Ilyenko, Vygotsky, Bakhtin, Voloshinov, where negativity is approached so in a very special mode because it hinges on definitely Hegelian negativity, but it somehow tries to get away from Hegelian teleology or the way today psychoanalysis treats Hegel as the constant difference, to transform it into some sort of self-critique and the philosophy of otherness. And what would be most important here, terminologically, is not negativity, is not so much annihilation or alienation, but Andersein, Hegel's term Andersein. And I think Marion Roche yesterday talked about this non-identity within Hegelian thought. And here we also deal with othering, the term of othering, non-self-being, and negativity understood not so much as nihilist approach, but rather this other determined non-self as the dialectical contradiction. I would now stop my screen, but would go on with two other sections, mostly what I observe as the tools of semantic manipulation, which somehow erase the critical element or the multidimensional semantics, making it literal. And this literal meaning was also very important in the Third Reich propaganda, quite similar to how it might be happening here. But now I would mention several examples from cultural politics which were taking place prior to contemporary military escalation, to show how easily this mutation, the anti-negativist, anti-critical mutation, can reside in the language and then contaminate the production and the production of consciousness, even for those who are not Putinist, and even for those people who were not fascist, for instance, in 30s. And Viktor Klemperer, in his book, The Language of Third Reich, is very well describing this phenomenon, how these manipulations seep and contaminate the language gradually. So I would dwell on how semantic manipulations erase dialectical breadth and incommensurability in favor of literal positivist signification, and how such manipulations develop techniques to stuff the signifier with random meaning profitable for those who program this impact. As I already said, these elements of lingua, of this contaminated language, can be produced not necessarily by those people who are supporting the autocratic governments, but still it will be in their language, and they will be producing this even regardless of supporting such regimes. But it is also important to keep in mind that the semantic technique of conservative or autocratic politics are very near to and are not so far from the domains of depoliticized happy industries of design, fashion, show business, and monetized networks, contemporary monetized networks that reproduce neoliberal lifestyles and thus dismiss or overtake critical theory. So I think that the problem is not necessarily with autocratic language and the language of autocracy, because the language of autocracy is not simply insisting on something ideologically terrible. It is simply erasing the capacity for critique from consciousness and from language. And the languages of glamour, or the languages of happy entertainment in design and fashion, are also contributing to this capacity. And interestingly, I mean, many were asking the question, why in contemporary Russia that was just prosperous with the oil and gas money, especially in capitals, and prosperous with the consumption, etc., all of a sudden this breakthrough of military logic and the military rhetoric, because total submergence in the languages of entertainment or the digital complacency is very easily manipulated in whatever you like. You know, I would even say that submergence in the consciousness of only laymen, totally depoliticized laymen, and indulgence in being the depoliticized layman is very near to then reproducing and accepting the autocratic linguistics. So I would maybe bring a couple of quotations from Otto Klemperer again, where he says the following: words can be like tiny doses of arsenic. They are swallowed, I noticed, appear to have no effect, and then after a little time the toxic reaction sets in after all. If someone replaces the words heroic and virtuous with fanatical for long enough, he will come to believe that a fanatic really is a virtuous hero, and that no one can be a hero without fanaticism. Or further on, populist volksstimmlich means more concrete. The more emotional a speech is, the less it addresses itself to the intellect, the more populist it will be, and it will cross the boundary separating populism from demagogy and mass seduction as soon as it moves from ceasing to challenge the intellect, deliberately shutting it off and stupefying it. So stupefying intellect by means of happy industry is not so far from stupefying intellect with affective emotionalization about heroic deeds of your native country. Another difference, or rather difference than similarity with German condition and German Nazism would be in comparison with contemporary linguistic manipulations that had been happening and that I had been observing in the latest 10, 12 years, would be that German Nazism and its technology was much more in transforming the modality of meaning of the word without any complete semantic distortion. So that the literalness of meaning was becoming primary. For instance, Victor Klemperer writes that certain meanings of words like ausziehen or ausgezogen or fanatic were initially ironic or pejorative, and then they were acquiring only affirmative impact afterwards as being used in Third Reich. But in Putinist conditions, the polittechnological method is a little bit different because it hinges on the following device. It tries to connect the disparate meanings, the incompatible meanings, and to supersede something with the opposite meaning even. For instance, in cultural politics, it could take place gradually. For instance, you appoint a conductor, just a conductor of music orchestra, who is a very good conductor, being the curator of the Venice Biennial. But then everyone acknowledges that it's a good cultural worker, but he's not a curator. Then nobody can dispute that he cannot be a curator, and then the conductor becomes a curator. So this is happening on every level. Or the film, which is a feature film, can become artist's film, but it is not an artist's film. Or in this connection, how cultural politics in this case works rhetorically, I would mention that it is not prohibiting contemporary culture, or it is not banning anything. It is simply appropriating and stealing the symbolic capital of contemporary practice and or of something that used to be critical practice, and then it is stuffing these labels and the empty shells of contemporaneity with the contents, I mean nationalist contents or the governmental contents, etc. I will give an example. For instance, if the Ministry of Culture appoints a curator, this cannot be a supporter of Putinist regime, but simply a curator which is complying with the governmental rhetoric. What she does is simply raiding the institutions producing critical culture with their symbolic capital, because it is already it has already acquired some popularity worldwide, but then this symbolic capital is stuffed by some kind of saccharine craftwork or fashion or design or some kind of works about technology. And this happens everywhere in cultural context. So you cannot blame cultural workers that they are forbidding anything, but they simply, in the packaging of contemporary culture, are producing something like Bill Viola or a certain sort of design, fashion, and then you can very easily add to these some patriotic images, which goes very well with the AI, artificial intelligence research, or the, I don't know, high-tech experimentation in advertisement. How long have I been speaking and how much do I have?
You spoke 40 minutes.
Okay, I'm finishing. I need another 5 minutes and okay. I will be finishing. So there are more examples which I can mention, but I would shift to the third section, which would be how to treat public space today, how to treat public space with so many failures. The failure of publicity and public space for cultural work, which was enacted by COVID conditions or the pandemic, and the failure of the public space, which hitherto and previously was already taking place with the election of Trump, or the failure of public space, which now, for instance, Russian cultural context experiences with totality of repressions. And then the question to the public space, even in the contemporary and for the contemporary democracy, maybe if art in its critical and political legacy were not so, if it were not so dependent on packaging and shells, maybe it would not be possible to sweep its institutional codes so easily. So the question is to what extent public space with its democratic agenda about care, became some sort of institutional formalism. In this sense, I would say that this collapse of negativity maybe, which here is supported by oil and gas prosperity, was also also part and parcel of creative industries which were contaminating not only post-socialist cultural production, but generally the cultural production globally. What I could witness in the theoretic research on art and production elsewhere, let's say, for instance, what was happening in Goldsmiths College, among others, it was more and more about immediate aestheticization of spheres trendy for discussion, which was algorithmic speculation and identity politics, but without negative problematization or paradoxic conceptual artistic approaches. Instead, what sufficed was much more importance of gaming networks, self-design, digital facilities, and of course techno fantasies and certain sort of indulgence in folklore and maybe some kind of new age mysticism. And therefore, in the end, I would dwell on the role of public space, which had been more and more turning in global art into simply audience. And we know that public space is, of course, not the audience and not is the breadth of audience or accessibility to audience. Public space was always essential for the social democratic agenda, but maybe even less important in liberal democracies. So how I would see the most important critical agency of public space, because for me it was not about accessibility to the audiences, and it wouldn't be obliged to be consensual in any way to what artist is producing, because nowadays there is this even demand from art institutions that we should be friendly to our audiences. We should not insult our audiences, because our audiences should enhance and they should proliferate. And now education should also be friendly to all layers of the society. But I would remind that historically the artists could use public space also for provocation, for rejection, for insulting that very public domain. And this revealed its negative agency, I mean the public space, since neo-avant-garde, since second avant-garde. It is precisely this site of tension which can bring together creative agents with different contents, or on the contrary, it could make sociality be rejected by the artist, or artistic practice be juxtaposed to sociality. So, I mean, this juxtaposition, this provocation is not denying public space, but maybe public space is this agency and arena of tension. And of course, Chantal Mouffe, when she debates agonality, she definitely implies this capacity of public space to intensify issues and put them, make them edgy. Yet there are some elements, as we see in the long run of this lengthy socially engaged discussion, when public space was becoming some sort of quasi-democratic homeostasis, when you can predict what will be criticized, when you can predict what will be debated. So what is important to say in the connection of Agon is that definitely it is a process of political critique, yet it is still somehow disregarding the extent of negativity which was important for contemporary art practices and which was important for Adorno. So I would say that in this case, I would side much more with Adornian negativity, which is counter-social, but to a certain extent, in these conditions, it is much more honest, because it doesn't believe that public space can be produced smoothly. Moreover, I think that Agon as the democratic debate probably is not able to see the vicious elements in the bureaucracy of art, for instance, but at the same time it underestimates the negativist self-referentiality of art. Because I mean, art was never nice, or art was never smoothly democratic. Art was also quite cruel, right? And it wanted to be deliberately cruel, and thereby it cannot be in its modernist cruelty or in its modernist undigestibility very smoothly brought into this public arena of agonality. I would say that this nihilist element is not very well probably not fully discussed by Chantal Mouffe. I would end with mentioning probably as examples personalities like Artur Zmejewski and Jonas Stahl, who still reproduce this undigestibility of modernist negativity, which it is not that they do not believe in democracy, but they show to what extent it is far and to what extent it cannot be yet reached. And I think this moment is a little bit unheeded by Mouffe and by certain socially engaged art institutions or projects, as they would believe in the grassroots efficiency of art's democracy, even though we see that Agon is not merely about publicity. Last but not least, what is also important, I would say that, you know, right before the war here, you know that a huge art center architectured by Renzo Piano was opened. It is called GUESS 2, VAC Foundation, and supported by an oligarch, Michelson. He's not necessarily pro-Putinist, but Putin came to the opening of these premises. It's an incredible achievement of maybe an avant-garde of architecture, the avant-garde of technology, and the program of these institutions quite prior to the military aggression. It was full of social agenda. It was full of studying the urban surrounding of unprivileged social layers, etc. So it was somehow translating all these social discourses of trying to translate the opportunity to have the public space back in this open urban context. Yet it is another proof that it is insufficient to have simply the quasi-democratic debate within public space, but maybe some more substantial and fundamental issues of critique should be undertaken in these conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone has questions?
I return in a moment.
Let's wait for Keti. Where is the camera for Keti?
It doesn't work.
Ah, she doesn't see us.
No, she doesn't.
Oh, hi Keti, it's Sami. You don't see me anyways, I heard. You have a...
I don't see you, but I hear you.
Yeah, you know how I look. It's the same as always. But I totally agree, actually, too. It's very productive, your mapping of how negativity is discussed in different schools of critical theory. Do you hear me now?
You have to speak a little bit louder.
Or maybe in microphone.
It is a microphone, but we could do... I could come to the computer. Yes.
I can very well speak, I can very well hear, for instance.
But he comes to
Bernard.
the computer because the microphone you hear through is on the computer.
Yes.
Now I speak to the computer. Is
Oh,
it better?
Now it's perfect, yeah.
Ja, gut. Das da brauchen wir gar nicht mehr. Okay. So I skipped the first part where we completely are in agreement, the mapping of negativity in different schools of critical theory broadly construed, continental philosophy. But the last parts that you mentioned, once you made a remark about the honesty in Adorno, where the art's functionless, the function of functionless in art as playing back negativity, social negativity, is something that maybe, I don't know, what is your diagnosis? It also refers to the last example that you made about the opening in Moscow. A society which is so, where the social bond is so saturated with negativity and at the same time the disavowal of negativity. The negativity, very technically speaking, class antagonism, meaning exploitation, or social cohesion produced through social exclusion, basic capitalism, where this has become the kind of unavoidable totalizing ether, that which is social mediation. If this is so clear, maybe the knowledge or disavowed knowledge of this translates into anxiety, into social anxiety, and that makes it kind of impossible to have the distance to endure cruelty and openly displayed negativity, kind of. Why? Art is a very interesting symptom of society. The inclination or the invitation to be nice to each other, to turn art into art therapy, is a clearly, I would say, it knows, it unconsciously knows about the negativity it has to disavow. Because if it would let it out, people would seriously not kill each other in the gallery, but you know what I mean. It is something obscene because everybody, knowing or not knowing, knows about the negativity that is there. That's why artists are so happy to be busy in their own anxiety for survival on the art market, to do good to other people's problems, the environment where I intervene and so on. At least it's not my problem. I can act out my own anxiety in the face of in fantasizing of doing good for other people. At least it's the others' misery I'm dealing with, and I even can produce myself as it. How do you relate to this? Because you're also invited often to speak in such spaces.
Yes, what you describe is fantastic. I mean, it would never occur to me. It's a very subtle description. What happens, especially in post-pandemic artistic context, when we talk about care, when the therapy actually has to supersede something radical or something critical. And your explanation is great because it's the justification is that I'm doing it for someone else. And the whole artistic context knows that it is very weak. It cannot be very negative. It cannot touch upon something really hard, that is hard to endure dramatically or even in terms of somebody's fates. So it cannot go very deep into others' fates, but it can at least arrange something. So I think this is a status quo, and I think to a certain extent this is also this is a negative condition. This is definitely a diagnosis that you make, but at the same time it tries a little bit to protect itself from this negativity. So this therapeutic element, I mean, it's the question how you describe therapy. Because psychoanalysis, for instance, is not therapy, right?
Yes.
It's a more
Cure.
hardcore thing. But if we deal with therapy, and I come across with my students that when I try to criticize therapy, they get angry.
Yeah.
How dare you? We have to deal with such difficult situations. We need therapy. And anyone who forbids us experiencing therapy or doing something therapeutic for others is simply somebody very cruel. So what is really very symptomatic that you emphasize is that if it was so easy to be cruel in 70s or 80s, and this hubris of cruelty, of this avant-garde roughness was representing art and part and parcel of art, nowadays this would simply be unbearable in a way. So it is really understandable to make it more smooth and more friendly. And in this friendliness, we have a trauma, which is also clinical. And therapy is clinic. So we remain in this clinic, and this post-pandemic clinic, and post-war clinic, maybe.
Would you? Otherwise, I have also follow up, but maybe very briefly only. Would you then say that the 70s open display of negativity as a certain cruelty, in order the condition of possibility of allowing a certain amount of negativity in the space of art and even in the public sphere necessitates a social welfare state and a certain limitation of social anxiety. Because otherwise, the space for art and also the public space is foreclosed. There is clinic before I speak. I mean, the pressure, I mean, I have the same issue with my students. I always try to say what's the difference between cure and psychoanalysis and what is therapy. But they say in the end, I don't care, but I need it because it's a mode of survival. That moment is already missed. The moment you enter the discourse, you're already in the therapy. It's not like a choice, So I understand the point.
I totally agree with you, but in 70s we deal with the Sartrean hero, who Sartrean hero or Althuserian hero, who puts this negativity as existential endurability, endurance. But nowadays, this subjectivity that has to endure this negative, which we have in Sartre's Stena wall, in Sartre's nausea, or or this subjectivity doesn't exist, and I completely agree that we cannot insist on this artificially. But at the same time, if we do art, you know, art as well as politics, it needs these intensities, well, to my mind. So maybe the negativity that we come across in the feminist performance of 70s in something like Valley Export or Karol Schneemann is unimaginable now, and maybe it was not socially productive, but at the same time it represented the intensity that tells about impossibility of social production. So it was negative in this sense. Nowadays we have fusion, we have a mutation between the social sphere and some kind of adjustment of all those consumption spheres, daily pop culture spheres, and artistic and political spheres. And the digital frame is only increasing this fusion, I think. So I don't know how to deal with this, but what you discuss is absolutely real.
Thank you, Keti. Super. Bernhard.
Keti, we are a little bit late, but only one last point that seems to me interesting in the last part, also in the discussion we have now with Sami. It is for me what is the nature of public space? How one defines the public space seems to me a very important point in this kind of therapeutical way of feeling in the public space. Because when you feel in a therapeutical situation in public space, you went in an exhibition that makes something good for you or for someone else, that means that the space is bordered, is covered.
The space is bordered?
Has a border. It is a border in the sense of it is, but also it is covered somehow, is sure, is make sure, like the children plays under the cover of the bed, as it is, it becomes the world, but it is a very limited space. So I have the impression that in this question of architecture, you was pointing out about the museum generally, or the public space, let's say generally. We use this public space as if the border was given.
Yes, yes.
But it is never named. It is given, and we assume it as given, but we could not name which is the horizon, which is the limit, which is what is outside, what is inside, so that we become careful with everyone who is inside. But we forget. Yes, you see what I mean about where is the border of the public space?
Yes, I think it's very exact that you delimited. In this case, I would say that ideally, what was happening, for instance, in so-called how do you call this art? Relational aesthetics. I mean,
yes, Bourdieu's
in Bourdieu's method, which was then continued in 90s in Russia, with some kind of radical experiences between politicians and artists. These borders were absolutely open. It was about clash. It was about clash within any context of society, within political context, journalistic context, media context. And the art institution that is constructing its beautiful and glamorous borders, of course, allows urban discourse inside, but I would agree that it wants to produce some kind of loyal space for it. But my impression is that this becoming of public loyal was happening a little bit everywhere. Of course, not as much as in post-socialist context, or not as much as in Russian, because in Russia this public space never existed at all. It was just translated as some sort of design of the necessity for contemporary artistic practice. But I would say that this public space was more vigilant in 90s or in the beginning of 2000 than it would be now, with so much focus on focus on science and representation of yourself. Mm-hmm. Representation of yourself is very important, of course.
Yeah. So, Keti,
yeah.
Thank you very much for having been with us. It was really nice to have you. And
it was very, very nice to be with you.
And I hope you have possibility to continue to look on the YouTube channel or look at it later. Sure. If you don't have it today. And
thank you.
Thank you very much. Hope we see you.
See you
very soon.
See you.
Okay, so we switch over to the performance of Maxime. We go back to the